Chapter 2 of Winning His Way by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, in which Frank learns of the perfidy of Mr. Jebb. Green River, the scene of this story, was a wide-awake town situated about 50 miles northwest of Chicago on a river of the same name and within 5 miles of the western shore of Lake Michigan. 12 years before, it had consisted of one factory and perhaps 50 houses. Now it was a great bustling town, with its banks, its hotels, its dozen churches, and its noisy streets. Probably in a year or two it would become a city. Already there were many handsome residences along the upper riverfront of the residential section, the finest of which belonged to Squire Roach, president of the First National Bank and one of the trustees of the Park Avenue Methodist Church. His son Duncan was, in his own opinion, the most aristocratic young man about town. At any rate, he wore more expensive clothes than any boy of his acquaintance, and he only associated in terms of equality with the young people whose parents were well-to-do. He had no use for boys who had to work for a living, and particularly he had no use for Frank Morris, who was his superior in every way but from a social standpoint. He cordially disliked Frank, and never failed to sneer at him both in public and in private. Latterly, since the day Frank had given him the dressing down for insulting Elsie Gray, he actually hated the young fellow, and his constant desire was for an opportunity to get even with him. When Frank approached the office of the Argus on Main Street, he passed Duncan Roach talking on the corner of the street with a crony. Duncan favored him with a malicious glance of ill-disguised satisfaction, and said something to his companion, who looked after Frank and laughed jeeringly. Frank saw the look and heard the sneering laugh, but of course paid no attention to either. He then reached the Argus office. The outer room, which answered for a business office, and was provided with 2 desks and chairs cut off by a railing, was vacant. The door leading into the combined composing room and press room was open, and glancing in, Frank saw Billings, the foreman, standing negligently beside the quarter-medium Gordon jobber, smoking a fat cigar, and talking to Gibson, the pressman, who was making a job ready on the machine. Billy Miggles was feeding the small Gordon, while 4 bright-looking girls were setting type at their respective frames. Nobody seemed to notice the appearance of Frank on the scene. "Mr. Billings seems to be taking things easy," muttered the boy. "Well, this is payday. I guess I'll get along without him hereafter." He heard a collection of voices engaged in conversation in the inner room, his father's editorial sanctum, now, of course, appropriated by Mr. Jebb. "Seems to be more talk than business going on in there," thought Frank. "And this is our busy day, too. No wonder the Argus is on the toboggan, when the heads of the departments are working on the go-as-you-please principle." The door was slightly ajar, and as the boy stood close to it considering how he would open his interview with the editor and manager of the paper, he plainly overheard the conversation going on within. He recognized the ponderous voice of Squire Roach, then the smooth, oily tones of Mr. Jebb, and at intervals the falsetto of Robinson, the new reporter. "You think there will be no difficulty, then, in my getting possession of the Argus for the sum I offered Mrs. Morris?" asked the squire. "I think not," replied Mr. Jebb. "I have strongly advised her to accept your offer. Billings and I figured the price low on your interest. The big press alone is worth more than $1,000. Gibson said it cost $2,500 second-hand. Then there are 2 Gordon jobbers, the paper cutter, a good assortment of job letters, and the paper outfit. The steam engine belongs to the owner of the building. I don't know anything about the value of the presses and printing material. I rely on your judgment and that of Foreman Billings, who is a practical man, for that," said Squire Roach. "Of course I want to get it as cheap as possible." "Certainly you do, Squire," said Mr. Jebb, lighting a fresh cigar, "and I have attended to that part of the matter for you. The Argus establishment is easily worth $3,000 as it stands. Isn't that a fact, Robinson?" "Cert," replied the dapper individual nonchalantly puffing at a cigarette. "Of course, the paper itself was a much more valuable asset when I took charge of it, but for our little arrangement it would still be what it then was, the leading Republican newspaper of the county." "Well," admitted the banker, "you certainly have hurt its reputation and commercial value to a considerable extent. That was what you expected of me, wasn't it?" "Yes. Mr. Morris and myself never were on the best of terms. I believe I have already intimated to you that I have political ambitions." Mr. Jebb nodded. "I tried to get the nomination for the legislature last fall, but Morris killed my chances. He supported Farmer Gray, who, by the way, was the only man elected on the Republican ticket from this county. When Morris took sick just before Christmas and employed you to take charge of the Argus during his absence, I thought I saw a chance to get back at the man who had me turned down." "I see," murmured Mr. Jebb. "I made your acquaintance, and by degrees approached you with a proposition to work in my interest. My idea was to wreck the Argus if possible while Morris was out of the way, and then start a new paper, placing you at its head." "Exactly," nodded Mr. Jebb again. "Your offer was too good to be turned down, since I figured that my position here was merely temporary. Morris was nothing to me, so we came to terms. I saw I could do very little as long as young Harwood was in the way. He was as staunch as steel to the Morris interests, so I got rid of him, hired Billings, an old-time comp, to look after the mechanical end, and sent for my friend Robinson, who happened to be out of a job. I knew I could depend on Robinson." "That's what," chirped Robinson, lighting a fresh cigarette. "Between us, we cooked up a plan to put the Argus under an eclipse, didn't we, Robinson?" "We did that," responded the reporter with a grin. "We mixed things up pretty well with the Republican Party, and as a consequence our subscription lists fell away and our advertising columns suffered. Then Robinson and Billings, between them, managed to put the job printing branch on the hog. At this point, seeing that Morris was slated for the graveyard and that it was only a question of a short time before he would die, I suggested that there would probably be an opportunity for you to buy the Argus out, which would be much more advisable than starting an entirely new paper. We calculated you would be able to secure it at a bargain after Morris's death. Then Robinson and I would get a hustle on and would build it up for you again. I think the fruit of our endeavors is now sufficiently ripe to drop into your hands." "You have managed very well indeed, Mr. Jebb," said the banker approvingly. "And your reward will be the editorial and business control of the Argus as soon as it comes into my possession. And it shall be yours as long as you choose to retain it, provided," and here the squire punctuated his remarks with a thump of his cane on the floor, "that you undo the damage you have done at my direction and build the paper up again to its former position in Green River." "Don't worry about that, Squire Roach. Robinson and I will attend to that. Won't we, Ajax?" "That's what we will, Amos. I've only to whistle and the advertisements will return." "You hear, Squire? The Argus will regain its lost influence in time to support you at the next election." "That's what I want," said the great man in a tone of satisfaction. "What you want you shall have. Remember, your name at the head of the editorial page will add immense prestige to the paper, Squire," said the astute Mr. Jebb, playing upon the man's weak point, his vanity. "You are the most important as well as the most popular man in town." Murmured the squire, who wasn't quite sure of the latter point, although he had long since persuaded himself of the truth of the former. "It is perhaps fortunate that I hold a mortgage on the Morris cottage for a matter of $800. This fact is bound to influence the widow in this transaction. On the whole, I think I can afford to be a bit more liberal and offer her $1,000. That will give her $200 over and above the mortgage, and it is not to be sneered at by a woman in her circumstances." "Even at $1,000, you'll be getting this property dirt cheap. All I have been afraid of is that her son, who is a pretty shrewd boy, I've discovered, might prevail on her not to sell the paper at that figure. I am bound to say that if she advertised it in the proper way, she could get very much better offers than this one of yours." "I think I'd better run over and see her, and try to bring the sale into a focus before she gets any such idea into her head," said the squire with the same precipitation. "I think you had myself. Don't let a bargain like this get away from you for want of prompt attention. I advise you even to go as high as $1,500 sooner than take any chances of losing it altogether," said Mr. Jebb, who felt it was to his interest that the big man should get hold of the paper as soon as possible. "You've got the right man you've got, Mr. Jebb," chirped in Robinson, who felt that he couldn't do better than support his friend at every emergency, whereupon the two friends looked across at one another and winked slyly, a little bit of pantomime which quite escaped Squire Roach's observation. "Yes, I will call on Mrs. Norris at once," said the nabob of Green River, rising from his chair, a signal that the interview was at an end. "And when I see you again," said Mr. Jebb, also rising from his editorial chair, "I hope the matter will have been finally settled to our mutual advantage." "I think you may rely upon that, Mr. Jebb," replied the squire condescendingly. Then Robinson opened the door, and the three walked out to find, much to their surprise, Frank Morris established at his ease in a chair in the outer office. Mr. Jebb wondered with some uneasiness if the boy had overheard any of their conversation. End of chapter 2.